Okay, so this afternoon we have the Revising Long Documents and Common Grammar Mistakes workshop. This is going to be hosted by Dr. Erin Zimmerman, the director of the Writing Center. She will be highlighting some of the goals and strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading long documents, as well as discussing grammar mistakes found in graduate level writing. So I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Erin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. I'll say I saw that folks had the transcripts on for the last session, so feel free to turn those on for me. But I will say that my Southern accent sometimes causes some difficulty, especially in Zoom, I've noticed, where my words start to run together and it comes up with some interesting translations of what it is that I'm saying. But if it's helpful for you, please do that. So yes, I want to talk a little bit about revising and editing long documents. I actually changed the title of the presentation kind of at the last minute without consulting Grad Academy, so hopefully that's okay. So a lot of the content is still going to be the same. Just when I was talking with my staff who ran this workshop last semester, they just felt like a lot of some of the grammar stuff started to get really tedious towards the end, and you all have already had a long day, so I consolidated a lot of that. So I've tried to make some adjustments so that what we're going to be looking at in terms of sort of grammar concerns, sentence level, language kinds of issues are really targeted to the expectations and conventions that exist for research writing at the level that you all are doing. So of course, while we all have errors now and again with commas and sentence fragments and things like that, I'm not going to talk much about those sort of foundational grammar concerns, but try and focus the presentation more on some of the ways that writers who are writing theses, who are writing dissertations, who are writing articles, proposals, maybe are struggling with some of the conventions that exist for writing in those genres. All right, so let me click on, there we go. So yeah, what I want to talk about first through this workshop are revising, editing, and proofreading, all super important steps in your writing process as you're going. So giving you some really specific kind of targeted strategies and tools for doing that work. And then, like I said, we're going to talk towards the end about some of the sentence level grammar mistakes that might exist, very much focused on the conventions for the high level academic writing that you all are doing. Oops, okay, so my cursor, there we go. All right, so first, revising, editing, and proofreading. So initially, what is the difference? And this may be something that all of you already know, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I just wanted to make sure that it gets mentioned. So when we talk about revising, we're considering the entire paper. So when we're revising, we're focusing on the content, the more sort of global, holistic overview sort of material through the paper. When we think about editing, this is sort of a step past revising. So after we've gotten a lot of the ideas, we make sure that everything that we're saying is actually coming across to the readers, that things are organized well, that our arguments have evidence to support them, right? Those kinds of things. After that happens, we're going to edit. And in the editing stage, that's when we're really considering the individual sentences and paragraphs. And is the language in those clear? Are the ideas that you're trying to convey really making sense sort of at that level? And then comes proofreading as sort of the last step. And that's when we're considering sort of the presentation, just these really kind of nitpicky details. Often the proofreading stage is the one that, because in part it comes at the very end, and because it's so detail oriented, a lot of writers, myself included, struggle to force ourselves to do that work, because by then we just want to be done. And this just often feels like a step that we just don't want to take the time to do. So revising, editing, and proofreading are all super important for the reasons kind of mentioned, right? We want the content to present, you know, the information that we need it to our readers, right? If our readers don't understand what we're trying to convey, that's a problem. When it comes to individual sentences that, you know, maybe I'm notorious for this, writing really long, complicated sentences, and the idea gets lost in my language, right? That becomes a problem. And then proofreading, you know, sometimes having that comma in the wrong spot changes the meaning of the sentence, or it distracts the reader from the ideas that you're trying to present, which it's minor, but it's also very important. So things that we really need to think about. However, revising, editing, and proofreading are all coming after the principal writing is finished. And there's a bit of a caveat there, right? Like you might be kind of revising and editing and doing some proofreading along the way, if that's your process. But a lot of times you're writing a chunk and then you're kind of going back and looking at it, or you're maybe writing the whole thing and then going back and looking at it. But it's rare that we're really doing a lot of this work, you know, with every single word that we write. So revising and editing in particular are recursive processes, and by that we mean cyclical, that you sort of do it again. Maybe you're doing these at different points in your writing. Proofreading is something that's really happening ideally at the very end, in part because if you spend a whole lot of time proofreading and getting every single little nitpicky detail correct, and then you realize, oh, this paragraph actually doesn't really convey what I need it to, I need to go back and rework this whole thing. All that time that you spent proofreading is now wasted because you've gone back and changed all of your sentences, right? So think about revising and editing as steps that you're going to take before you get to your final proofreading. All right, so I want to go step by step through each of these and sort of talk quickly about each one. And then, like I said, give some really specific strategies that ideally you can adapt, or, you know, take an idea and try something even completely different than what I've offered, but maybe it triggers some sort of idea for a way that you revise well or edit well, or you want to just practice to see how it works for you. So with revising, as I mentioned, you're considering the entire paper or entire sections of the paper. And here's where you're focusing on the quality of the content and the logic of the organization. So your goals when it comes to revising include what are listed here. So thinking about, have you fulfilled the assignment requirements or the goals, right? Have you done the things that are expected for your thesis, for your dissertation, for your proposal? Have you met those criteria? You're reviewing the overall purpose of the document. Does it do what it intends to, right? Do your arguments make sense? Are they clear? Do we see how things are connecting and really conveying a particular message to the audience? You're strengthening your structure, your organization. A lot of folks like to call that flow, right? So you're thinking about, is everything logical? Does everything make sense coming one after the other, after the other, after the other? You might need to narrow your topics down. Maybe things are still a little too broad. You're not talking about them quite succinctly enough, or in a way that's as precise as it needs to be. You might need to kind of elaborate on your ideas, make something a little more clear, add some more details, some more evidence, to make sure that you're really proving the claims that you want to be making. You're also thinking about cohesion, right? If we think about, I often think about sort of a cohesion being a thread from the thesis statement in the introduction and sort of pulling that thread all the way through the paragraphs. Does it make sense that, you know, each idea has this direct connection back to the thesis statement? Do we see, you know, if it was a web or a map, do we see that there's a clear connection there? That's cohesion. And then sort of along those lines, think about transitions, right? That your idea in one paragraph is moving logically into your ideas for another paragraph. So of course, there are tons and tons and tons of strategies that exist out there. What I've tried to do here are list strategies that are a bit more kind of hands-on or visual or interactive. You know, I think a lot of times as we're writing and sort of getting stuck into really long documents, we just kind of keep focusing on the page, right? And writing on the page or typing on the page, leaving comments on the page. And sometimes it can be helpful, especially if we are more visual learners or kinesthetic learners or audio learners, to try out some different strategies that kind of take us away just from the reading and the thinking and the writing. So that's a bit what I've tried to do here. So feel free to, you know, mix and match, try what works, take parts of one and apply it to another, you know, play with it. It's not meant to be, this is the only way you can use this strategy, okay? So you might create a checklist of all of the assignment requirements. So, you know, a lot of times if we think about our classes, we get an assignment prompt and we have that piece of paper, you know, pull out what are the things that I need to do and make a literal checklist that you can kind of check off when you've done those things. Same thing with the thesis, with the proposal, with the dissertation. You know already what a lot of those criteria are. You could list those out and as you go, have you done those? Are you seeing those as you're working, right? And keep track that way. And that's helpful because sometimes, you know, if you haven't checked something off, oh, maybe I need to go back and revise to make sure that I've fulfilled that, right? So think about in terms of organization of a particular paragraph, you might read the paragraph's topic sentence and then read the rest of the paragraph to make sure, okay, does that say what this paragraph is doing? Sometimes we sort of get into the flow of writing and where we go ends up not being where we thought we were going. And we need to rework that topic sentence to make everything a bit more coherent. You can create a reverse outline. So what you do with the reverse outline is for each section or ideally each paragraph, you're going to summarize, okay, what is this paragraph talking about, you know, in a word or a phrase. And then as you go through and look at your sections or look at your paragraphs, does this seem like a logical order, or maybe should some of these paragraphs be rearranged to flow better? You might explain the points that you're trying to make to a friend or a family member. It's often helpful to discuss what you're trying to say to a non-academic audience. Because ultimately, even though all of what you're writing is very focused in your discipline, right? It's very centered and you're writing about very high level content and really creating new knowledge. You have people on your committee who aren't as expert in this topic as you are. So you do need to make sure that you're explaining in ways that a general, you know, educated person would be able to understand. So sometimes being able to talk to a friend, to a family member, and then compare, okay, what did I tell them? How did I explain it to them? To your explanations in your writing, sometimes that can help you better clarify what it is that you're trying to say, and you can revise in that way. You can also use color codes for a variety of things. The example I give here is in your paragraphs, you can color code your claim, the claim that you're making in one color, and then identify, okay, where is my evidence for that claim, right? To ensure that everything, all of your claims are in fact supported. So again, you can use those in a variety of different ways. I'm just giving you sort of one example for each, but hopefully that gives you some ways to think about, okay, what is the problem that maybe I have with this particular paragraph, this particular section, or with revising more generally that I don't have a strategy for? Maybe I can apply one of these. All right, so that leads us to editing. So editing is sort of the step below revising, where we're looking at sentence level, paragraph level issues, and really thinking about language. This is where clarity becomes super important in terms of the language itself. So our goals with editing, things we can kind of really pay attention to are lengthy sentences and paragraphs. If we realize like, oh, God, that sentence is like 6 lines long, maybe I need to see about breaking that up. Maybe the language just seems kind of wordy, or you've used a lot of jargon, checking to see, okay, what could I maybe cut? How could I maybe make sure I'm defining any terms that folks don't know? Checking for accuracy and specificity in your word choice. So again, you all are writing at a very high level. So there are words that we use when we're just chatting with one another that are fairly vague, right? So making sure that the language you're using is as specific as it should be. Thinking about your tone, making sure that you're coming across as professional, as the scholar that you are, but also being inclusive, right? This is something we more and more need to really be paying attention to when we're writing, and advisors, journals are looking for that. And then finally, making sure that you're using your source material responsibly, right? That you're integrating all your sources in ways that are appropriate. So a handful of strategies, again, thinking about trying some different sorts of actions. So read your paper aloud. A lot of times you'll find, especially with wordiness or with really long sentences, you're going to stumble, or you're going to be gasping for breath by the time you get to the end. So this can be helpful to just kind of help you identify something in your writing that you don't see when you're reading silently to yourself, but actually hearing it. I would also say if it's better for you, and for some folks it is, to hear somebody else read it, put your paper through a text-to-speech editor platform app. And that is something that a lot of writers do quite a lot, and have told us in the Writing Center have been really helpful for them. So I mentioned vague words, right? So in Microsoft Word and Google Docs, you can find, edit finds words. So especially if there are words that tend to be sort of crutch words that you use a lot, as one of our examples here, use that function, find that, and then replace that with more precise language for that particular sentence. Or just as you're going, if you notice, oh, here's a word that I've noticed I've used a couple of times, and I should probably find a better word for that, right? You can find and replace. So in other similar ways, you can locate technical words. So you can replace those, or a lot of times for you all, the technical words. So if you're just kind of skimming through your pages quickly, you'll be able to spot those in the page. And with those, I think a lot of times, maybe they're not necessary, right? If we're thinking about terms that are like super jargon filled, you might not need to use those. There might be another term to use. That being said, a lot of times it is important to use jargon. So don't be afraid of jargon. Just make sure that your terms are defined, right? So find where you're using those words, and at least with the first time you use it, make sure that you have a definition there included so that your readers, if maybe they don't understand, they will as they move forward and keep reading. You might highlight, so whether by hand or in your text editor, highlight these sentences, right? Okay, this one, here's one that's really long, you know, let me come back to this one later and figure out how to cut some language, rephrase language, divide the sentences, whatever makes sense for you, to make sure that it's not too difficult for your reader to get through that sentence and follow your ideas. Same thing for paragraphs too, right? As a reader, if you're reading a very long paragraph, you'll find that you might struggle to get to the end of it and retain what the main idea is. So find ways to divide your paragraphs. Another thing to do if concision in particular is something that is valued in your field, so particularly STEM fields, this is a big thing. I'm sure your advisors have been like, be concise. So you want to paraphrase source material instead of quoting it. Paraphrasing 99% of the time is more concise than quoting. So of course, there are reasons to quote, so have a clear sense of why you're quoting it, if in fact you are. So I'm not saying never quote, although again, in STEM, paraphrasing is valued much more highly than quoting anyway. But if concision is something that you're really trying to focus on, look for any places that you've quoted and determine, can you instead paraphrase what it is that author was trying to convey. All right, that brings us to proofreading. So proofreading, as I mentioned, is really focused on the really kind of tiny details. And like I said, this is often the part where writers just get exhausted and we don't want to look any longer at what we've written. And it's very important to proofread. And you know, it's sort of a problematic thing in my view, because really, you know, it's about judgment, right? In the same way that it's probably happened to you, or you probably witnessed, you know, somebody judging somebody else who's speaking because they have an accent, or because they're, you know, using the English language incorrectly or something like that. That's also happening when we write. We're being judged by our reader. And it's not always a negative thing. It's not always like, oh, you don't know how to write. Why don't you know how to use this, you know, punctuation correctly? But because of the level of the writing that you're at, there are just these expectations for good or for ill, right? I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, but it exists, right? And I think probably we've all had moments where we've read something where we've been like, what was this person doing? Were they paying attention? Right? So this is your chance to show your audience that yes, you are paying attention. You're going through, you're correcting any of these little tiny errors, anything that maybe looks a little funny, anything that maybe will, again, sort of draw your readers' attention away from your ideas and to something that doesn't really matter that much, right? So that's what we're doing with proofreading. So spelling, punctuation, grammar, formatting, Making sure that all of your formatting, your headings, your bullet points, all those sorts of things are in alignment in the ways that they need to, that, your fonts for your headings are all consistent. Those kinds of things, though minor, are important, especially if we think about those sorts of things, because as humans, we're trying to make sense of patterns. So if, your headings aren't consistent, all of a sudden your reader's getting confused. Wait, is this a subsection of that section, or is this separate, or what's happening, right? And you don't want your reader to have that experience when they're reading. They want to feel very focused on the ideas. Same for design elements, making sure your page layout, your figure design, all these sorts of design pieces, again, are not inconsistent, but that they are consistent, that they are set correctly. All right, so a few proofreading strategies. Watch for the spelling and grammar recommendations in the text editor. You will be surprised how many times the Writing Center consultants say something to writers that they're working with about, like, hey, did you notice that there's a squiggly line under this word or under this phrase in Microsoft Word? That's not to say that the recommendations the text editors are giving you are always correct. Okay, so don't just mindlessly go through and approve all of the changes. But pay attention to those, because often they're pointing you in the right direction. I mentioned text-to-speech app before, in terms of thinking about some of the longer or larger editing issues. You might also be able to hear typos and misspellings that, again, your eyes just don't catch when you're reading. So if you've spelled a word wrong, you're going to hear it when the app tries to read it back to you, and you're like, what was that word? Wait a second. Again, so use the find function. I think a lot of times folks think about the find function for words. Use them for punctuation marks as well. So in particular, ones that okay, I really struggle with semicolons. We're going to talk about semicolons. So, use the find to see, okay, where are my semicolons? Am I using them correctly? I mentioned this yesterday as a really great tool for everything that you're doing when you write, but find a model document. In particular, when we're thinking about formatting, these model documents from your fields can really help you get a sense of, okay, what does my heading need to look like? What do my bullet points need to look like? Those kinds of things. Also, those of you working on thesis and dissertation, I'm sure you already know this, but I'm going to reiterate it. The library has formatting conventions that you have to reformat your paper into when you submit it to the library for them to publish it after you passed your defense. Okay, the grad college has folks who can work with you, help you navigate all of those things, but if you're still really early in the process, if you kind of have time now, you might go ahead and start setting up, Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever text editor you're using. Set your styles, set your page formatting, your margins, all that kind of stuff. You might go ahead and do that now so that it's already preset in your documents that you're drafting now for that final version. And then another thing, so thinking about the fact that anytime you're using sources, anytime you have an in-text citation, that source needs to also appear in your reference page entries, and vice versa. If it's in your reference page entries, it needs to be cited somewhere in your text. So you might print your reference pages and then go through maybe on the screen, or if you want to print the whole thing out page by page physically, but okay, here's this reference, where have I cited it, right? I would recommend doing it on the screen, having a printed version that you can look at of your reference pages, and then have the rest of the paper on your computer, just because then you can just, type the first name of the author, the bit of the title, and search for it in the document, and then you're not literally having to flip through every page yourself to find that. But that's a good way to make sure that all of your sources are in fact cited appropriately. So let me check the chat real quick. It looks like, all right, so tricks for paraphrasing when your brain is fried. So honestly, the best piece of advice I have for paraphrasing, unfortunately, it just is what it is. So whether your brain is tired or not, what I recommend doing is reading the original source several times until you're really certain that you understand it. And I don't mean the whole document, right? Just the paragraph or the section, the excerpt that you're working with. Make sure you fully understand that, and then put it away. And then type with, your own interpretation of that. Or one thing that can be helpful is if you have someone else around you, is to tell it to them, or even speak it into a recording device, and then listen back to it. Sometimes I find that actually works a little bit better than typing it out and then sort of comparing. But that's honestly the best way to paraphrase, is to not have the original source sitting there and you looking at that and trying to paraphrase while you're looking at it. That honestly, it sounds contradictory, but that honestly makes paraphrasing harder. So read it, understand it, set it aside, and be like, okay, what is it that says? It's telling me this thing, right? And I would say too, as you're doing that, again, think about explaining it to a friend or a family member. Don't think about keeping it at the same sort of excuse me, scholarly tone necessarily as that writer originally wrote it. But feel free to kind of play with that a bit, because again, that's easier for you to comprehend, and it's easier for your readers to comprehend, and less work for you as you're paraphrasing. Okay, so how can you be sure that your reference is based on APA style? You got to get that APA style guide. You've got to go onto the website. That's honestly really just what you have to do. So the Writing Center, we have some handouts on APA that may be helpful, because they illustrate some of the most common texts that folks cite in their writing. So you're not having to look through the whole book to find what you're looking for. But yeah, honestly, if you want to make things potentially easier, I highly recommend one of the citation generators. Ideally, I would use one of the bibliographic apps, like Zotero and Mendeley, those kinds of things, where you're storing all of your sources anyway. But those often will spit out sort of, a draft, a rough draft, basically, of your reference page for you. So that can cut out some of the work. That being said, they're about 80% correct. So you have to go back through those and know what your references should look like, and edit based on that. That being said, citing when you were first doing it feels very overwhelming. As you go, you're going to be seeing the same types of sources over and over and over. So, you're probably going to have 20 articles, right? So after you've looked at, the template for what an article citation should look like, once you've done that 5 or 6 times, there are things you're going to start remembering. And then you're going to look at the next one and be like, oh yeah, no, that's wrong. Like before you even go back and look at the template, you're like, oh, that shouldn't be capitalized. That should be lowercase, right? So as you get into it, you'll find that it starts to go more quickly. But yeah, you really just need to find a resource. So go online. There are bunches and bunches of websites that have APA citation support. Feel free to come to the Writing Center, especially if there's a text that you're citing that you're just not sure how to cite. We do every once in a while get some kind of funky texts, funky sources, and we, just have to almost create our own citation for those based on, the best rules that exist, because technology is changing, so sources are changing. All right, so thinking about tracking your work, save as often as you can and back your work up. Do not just let this document live on your laptop. I myself had a case when I was working on my dissertation where my laptop slid off of what it was sitting on, and I had a flash drive in it, and the flash drive cracked. So everything that I had saved on the flash drive that wasn't backed up elsewhere, gone. So thankfully it wasn't a ton. I think it was probably about 20 pages or so out of my whole dissertation, but it was still painful. So back up multiple places all the time. If you are somebody that likes to have multiple versions, so unlike, okay, so for example, in Google Docs, right, you can just go in, you can make changes, and then it saves your new changes onto your old changes, right? If you're somebody that doesn't want that to happen, but you want to have an individual copy of every draft that you're working on as you're going, right? So here's my introduction chapter from today. Here's my introduction chapter from Friday. Here's my introduction chapter from last week, right? That's cool, do that. Just make sure you have everything dated, like in the file name, so that you don't start confusing things. If you are going through, in particular, when you're revising and you're cutting things, save that. So wherever it makes sense, often we recommend just opening a different file. I always label mine trash, and keep it all there. I can't tell you how many times I've deleted something and then been like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Because I think what I wrote there, I could actually rework and use somewhere else. So don't just delete things and never to be seen again. Also, other kind of pieces of advice, things that you think, oh, this might be helpful later on, find a place to save those. Any free writing that you do, any notes that you that you end up kind of taking to yourself, right? Make sure you save those in a place that you'll remember to go back and check every so often. You might use the comment function for some of those things to have along the side of your draft. Just depends on whether that, sort of works for you, or if that gets distracting or that kind of thing. When you're keeping track of your sources or your themes, especially, I would say this is helpful when you're writing your literature review. That's a place to color code, all right? And then keep a key for whatever system you are working on. Let's see, okay, I'm just checking the chat. Looks like everybody's good. All right, so let's talk a little bit about expectations and sort of grammar, sentence level errors. The main thing I will say is to read writing in your field. Read, 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 because that is really going to help you as it comes time for you to think about what the conventions are, what the expectations are, whether that is, how are papers, academic papers structured? What comes first? What's the first section? What's the next section? All the way down to, what is the tone, right? What kind of jargon gets used? How often is it used? How do folks define their terms, right? That kind of thing can differ from discipline to discipline. So the more you read in your field, you just kind of inherently start to pick that up. But in particular, right, thinking about metacognition, which we talked about before, if we're trying to pay attention to those sorts of things consciously, that's going to be really helpful as we're going and applying that to our own writing. All right, so let's start with tone. So tone is the sort of character or attitude of a work. So we often talk about formal tone or informal tone. And tone really comes down to word choice and structure, right? So probably you know this, again, even if it's just sort of inherently, maybe nobody said it out loud, but you have a sense, right? That academic writing, that the tone there needs to match what it is that you're doing and who it is that you're writing to, right? So you're writing to a public audience, that's very different than writing to your thesis committee, right? So you still need to be clear, you still need to be understood, but the tone's going to be quite different. So at the level that you all are writing at, you really need to think about sort of formality. You want your language to be direct and clear, right? You're not just sort of talking circles around the idea, right? Just straight to the point. You're really focusing on the facts. You want everything to be consistent across all of your paragraphs, across all of your sections. And there's this expectation of objectivity, right? You're not feeling things through I mean, we are feeling things as we write for sure. But that's not being presented in our papers, right? So all those feelings that are happening when we're like crying as we're writing, stressed out, that's not being presented. Everything is coming across very objectively. So in terms of tone, some particular things to pay attention to when we think about tone. Know when to use the first person pronouns, right? So sometimes, sorry, I just got an alert and I want to, 1 second. I just want to silence it so that it doesn't ding again for y'all. Okay, there we go. Apologies. Just didn't want there to be a million dings distracting you. Okay, so first person pronouns. So I and we and me, right? So it's not to say avoid first person pronouns, but know when you should use them, right? Again, some disciplines, hey, it's cool. In this study, we examine, right? Other disciplines, they're like, no, this study examines. Okay, so pay attention to when and how and where to use first person pronouns. Make sure that you are giving signposts. So signposts identify for the writer kind of what's happening. So things like, for example, right? All of a sudden we know, okay, you've just explained something to us and now you're going to illustrate that. Right? However is another one, right? Now, all of a sudden we know we're contrasting ideas, right? Okay, there was one thing, now something else is happening. We also see signposts with things like first, second, third, right? As maybe we're listing a variety of maybe, tools from our methodology or that sort of thing, right? So think about ways that just some of these phrases or words can help help you and help the reader make connections among everything that you're writing about. Okay, so a handful of things to avoid. I don't always focus on things to avoid, because I do think there's nothing that's like 100% never, ever, ever do that, right? But here, I would say most of these are things that you very, very rarely should think about doing in your academic writing at this level. So what to avoid? Second person pronouns. So you should not be using the word you. You should not be writing directly to your reader, right? Writing. Did I say reading? You should not be writing directly to your reader. That's what I meant to say if I didn't. So try to avoid the use of you. Avoid the use of contractions. That's probably something you've all heard, but spell these words out. Cannot, did not. Avoid informal or colloquial language. Sometimes this is harder to pinpoint exactly what that is. And this can be something that it is helpful to, occasionally like have somebody else sort of read what you're writing, come to the writing center, use the text to speech app, right? Those kinds of things, because you might hear them or somebody else sometimes can pick them up. Maybe when we can't, we just don't see them anymore. Hyperbole is something to pay attention to. So be careful of times when you're saying very, always, oh, this thing is obvious. Oh, this was such a unique result, right? Unique means that it does not exist, right? Elsewhere. Obvious means that everybody here should have seen that that was coming. And that might not necessarily be the reality of it. So be careful of those kinds of words. We talked a little bit about objectivity. So again, be careful of emotive language. Oh, it's heartbreaking that this is the result that happens to this population, like these things, right? Be careful of that. Or I feel that in our field we need to avoid that kind of language. And then also try to avoid any sort of generalizing. The examples here come more from a lot of times what we see in like freshman level writing. Since the beginning of time, this thing has been happening, or all students believe such and such. It's like, not necessarily. Have you polled every single student that exists everywhere in the world to know that they believe that thing? So generalizing maybe doesn't look quite like this in your writing, but pay attention to any of those moments where maybe you're saying something where it's like, can I prove that that's true? If I can't, maybe let me back up, right? And rephrase that, put in some qualifiers. Some students might believe, right? Those kinds of things can help. So I mentioned inclusivity just a little bit ago. So important to pay attention to your word choices that indicate who you envision as your audience, right? So really thinking about your writing as being fair, unprejudiced, and unoffensive, right? So specifically, things that you can do along these lines, use gender neutral options. So more and more and more in APA and in MLA, the third person plural pronoun there, it's okay to use that in singular form. The researcher wrote their article, as opposed to using he or his as kind of the stand-in for all researchers, since there are female researchers, right? So there as the singular third person is what's preferred in most cases now. Again, you might want to double check with your discipline, with your advisors, but that tends to be the expectation now. Beware of defaulting to dominant demographics, right? So the example here, all participants were American, right? what is meant here is that all participants were from the United States, right? Canadians, Mexicans, they're American as well. So being careful about sort of using a term that is actually quite broad to mean something specific, okay? Avoid language that demonstrates a lack of respect or understanding. So we have here, you know, the difference between illegal aliens versus undocumented workers, right? That undocumented workers is the preferred term. That illegal aliens does demonstrate a lack of respect. So again, you all in your fields, depending on what you're writing about, you probably are already very aware of the language that is preferred. But if there's any question, you know, do some Google searching, talk to your advisor, to somebody in your field to find out for sure. Excuse me. Concision. So it talks a little bit about concision in terms of paraphrasing, but concision is about writing or revising language to make sentences more straightforward, deliberate, and effective. So concision doesn't always mean that it's shorter, right? That's the way we think about it, because typically what's happening is that we're cutting out unnecessary words or rephrasing sentences that are vague or unnecessary, and in fact making them shorter. But there might be times where you're actually lengthening the number of words that you're using, on the court, to in fact be more straightforward, more effective, more concise. So a few ways to make sure that you're being concise. So replacing vague words with specific words. The poll results demonstrate the various and different ways, right? Various and different could mean who knows what, versus they demonstrate 6 distinct ways. Beware of repetition. So events in past history, right? You can just say history, right? So things like that, being aware of instances where, right, events in history, you don't really need both of these. That's kind of repetitive. So eliminating placeholders. Is a big placeholder, right? There are many causes instead of the many causes include, right? Eliminate nominalization. So nominalizations are when a verb or an adjective functions as a noun. So instead of the court's decision is dependent upon, the court's decision depends, right? Here, depends is that noun. Is that verb? That's what I mean. Verb, ignore noun, is the verb. The court's decision depends. So pay attention to any places where you have phrases and could use single words instead. So due to the fact that can become because. Okay, active versus passive. So again, there is a purpose for both of these. They're under no circumstances should everyone always avoid active voice, and should everyone avoid passive voice. There's a time and a place for both of them. So with active voice, what's happening is the focus of the subject is on, when the focus of the sentence is on the subject, okay? The subject is the one doing the action. In passive voice, the subject is receiving the action. So the focus is on the action itself. So active voice, typically valued in social science and humanities research, and often is more concise. Passive voice, typically historically valued in STEM, although that is starting to change. We're seeing more and more active voice in STEM. Often it tends to be less concise. Again, that's not always the case. So as I mentioned, active voice, the focus is on who is doing the action. So the researchers surveyed, tobacco companies rejected, right? We know who's doing them. Those entities are important. Passive voice, importance is on the reception of the action, right? Teachers were surveyed. By who? right? We don't even know, it doesn't say. The hypothesis was rejected by tobacco companies. Okay, so there we know who did it, but the focus was on the hypothesis being rejected, not that the tobacco companies are the ones doing that rejection. All right, verb tenses. So some style guides have verb tense preferences, so make sure, again, you double check about these. But typically, this is how you see verb tenses appearing throughout the sections of a thesis, a proposal, a dissertation. So the introduction section, typically, it's going to be simple present tense or simple past tense. Literature review, same, also maybe present perfect, right? Depending on which particular element you're sort of talking about. Are you writing about your own synthesis of the sources? That's going to be present tense. Looking at research that's already been done, that's past tense. If you're talking about current research that's happening now, present perfect. Okay, and I'm going to give you some examples of each of these too. So again, methods, discussion, results, conclusion, right? Verb tenses that are, again, not 100% always used, but typically this is how you use each of the verb tenses. So I'm not going to go through all of them. You can come back and look at this slide. The slides are posted on Web Campus for you. So once you get to those sections, come back and check this. All right, so simple present tense, right? So we use those to discuss things in the present. So I have some examples here. Insulin and glucagon regulate blood glucose levels, right? Present tense. An elevated glucose level indicates present tense. Further studies are needed, present tense. Past tense, okay? Probably could guess, right? Things that are happening at a definitive time or a place in the past, right? So actions that have already occurred. Protocol X was used, past tense. Present perfect, things that are sort of ongoing. So maybe started in the past and are still occurring, or potentially like happened in the past entirely, but didn't happen at a specific time, right? So many studies have focused, right? So, all right, maybe all those studies have happened already, have focused, or maybe some of those studies are currently happening as well, and they have focused, right? So I don't want to get too deep into all of that, because sometimes I think when we really start to scrutinize, we start to confuse ourselves. But most likely you were already sort of doing a lot of this work in terms of knowing which verb tense to use based on your sentence, but be thinking about your section, right? Things like your results for the most part need to be talked about in past tense, because I'm sorry, that's not right. Your methods, your methods need to be talked about in past tense because you've already created them, right? So be paying attention to exactly what your verb tenses are. The main thing to note is not, is this present perfect? Did I do this right? But watch for a shift, right? One sentence in past tense, the next sentence in present tense, that might be a problem. Okay, that's really the thing to for the most part, pay attention to. That's most commonly where errors are occurring. So I've got some common mistakes here to kind of help out. So watch out for when you're using present perfect when past tense is what's actually needed. So researchers have collected versus researchers collected. Researchers did collect the thing at the time, right? Again, thinking about your methods, they did this. Using past tense for something that's ongoing, so sort of the opposite. The results led to a deeper understanding. So They led to an understanding in that moment versus these results have led to a deeper understanding. This understanding is ongoing, right? Using past tense for something that is a general fact. General facts need to be present tense. So female GTAs experienced disproportionate amounts of gaslighting. So specific ones experienced this thing versus, hey, a lot of female GTAs experience this, right? This is a fact. All right, so super quick, talk about a little bit of punctuation, and then we will wrap up. So the colon is sometimes confusing for folks. I would say a lot of folks, because they don't know how to use the colon, they just avoid the colon. And that's fine. That's a cool workaround, but the colon can be helpful at times. So you're using a colon, the first rule when using a colon are when you're joining independent clauses, and an independent clause is a phrase that is a complete sentence. So it has a subject and a verb. You can have it stand on its own. But when using a colon, the second clause is summarizing or explaining something that's happened in the first. So you can often think about the colon as a substitute for like thus or as follows, or some transition words like that. Here you also see in these examples that the second clause, the clause that comes after the colon, as long as again, both clauses are complete sentences, which they should be, you can capitalize the first letter of the first word after the colon or not. It's up to you. Okay, but so life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. That's a place for a colon. A colon also introduces a list, an example, an explanation, or a block quote. Okay, you do still have to have an independent clause, so complete sentence, or an adverbial phrase before the colon. So again, here the middle one, you have two options. That is a complete sentence, colon, option 1 or option 2, right? The second one, we see, for example, colon, right? And here we have a block quote coming. But that's one of the few examples where a complete sentence does not occur before the colon, is with these kind of adverbial phrases. Semicolons, I said we would mention semicolons. So basically 2 rules for semicolons. So to separate independent clauses that are not joined by a conjunction, so a conjunction or and or but nor, fanboys, if you know fanboys, is the acronym for those. So basically these can be 2 complete sentences. You could have a period here and start the second sentence instead of the colon. I'm sorry, excuse me, instead of the semicolon. Your choice, right? Usually the semicolon indicates that there's more connection between these sentences than a period where they're just very separate. So Louise Erdrich is of Ojibwe and German descent. She writes about both heritages in her novels. Again, could be 2 complete sentences with a period. That would be fine too. To separate items in a complex series. So if you have a whole list of things, but you've got punctuation within those lists, you're going to want to use a semicolon instead of a comma. So normally, if we were to shorten this, some classic science fiction sagas are Star Trek, comma, Battlestar Galactica, comma, and Star Wars, period. But since we have this other information, Star Trek, comma, with Mr. Spock, now we need a semicolon so that it's clear what each item in the series is. All right, single quotation marks. Single quotation marks, these are kind of cool because they really just have a couple of uses. They indicate a quote within a quote or a title within a quote. That's it. So here we see Silent Night, that's its own title within a longer title. And the second, most of the time is a quote within a bigger quote that's happening. That's the only time you use single quotation marks. Not to be confused with apostrophes. Apostrophes are different, even though they look the same. And then just kind of want to mention briefly punctuation and capitalization that are connected to punctuation marks. So when you're starting a quote and you have an attributive phrase, Malcolm X said, you have a comma before the quote happens, and you have your quotation marks. Periods, commas, and question marks, you're going to put inside the quotation marks. So here at the end of that sentence, we have today, period, quotation mark, right? Colons and semicolons, however, go outside. So if we scroll through here, sort of to the middle of the second example, we have today, quotation mark, semicolon. So watch for that. Okay. And that just brings us to the very end, last slide. So a few reminders, revision, as well as editing, recursive, right? You're probably going to do this at different points through your writing process. And you're probably going to revise something, you know, think about it for a bit and go back and potentially revise it again. Use your prompts, use models of writing as checklists or as, you know, kind of guides to help you make sure that you're covering everything you need to, that you're formatting things the way that you need to. That can be really helpful. Don't recreate the wheel. Again, you know, people have come before you and they have done this work successfully. Use their knowledge, okay? Don't just flounder and struggle. Like, go find something that helps give you a sense of what it is you're supposed to do. Read aloud, use text to speech. It often helps to hear what it is that you've written instead of just reading it silently to yourself. Make sure you're revising earlier in this process and proofreading at the end, right? And do schedule a writing center consultation if you get stuck at any point through any of this. We do have revising, editing, and proofreading handouts. So, you know, after this, if you're like, Erin, none of your tips really helped, maybe go check, you know, the editing handout to see if there are other suggestions on there that maybe clarify things for you, or schedule a consultation and, you know, chat with the consultant and be like, Erin gave this presentation, it was okay, but not great. Can you help me? Right? And they'll be thrilled. All right. I think that is all I have. Let me escape.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Erin. That was super informative and seems very useful to the projects everyone is working on this week. This will be available on our YouTube channel for future reference, and we'll have it linked in the Web Campus course. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we will see you back at boot camp.
Good luck, everybody.